Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com, and here's just a quick preview of what I'm going to work on today. As you can see, this was a fairly complicated piece. There's a lot of different aspects that made it more difficult than most of my other pieces, but it was a great learning experience. So I did approach this initially I did approach this piece initially in the same manner that I normally approach most of my pieces. However, I did have to adapt my style for this because my initial style is to normally rough out the basic structure, the basic pose of the characters. But what I discovered, because there's so many characters involved in this piece, that doing so actually limits my drawing ability for this. So that's something I had to work around. So I did use a lot of reference material in order to work on this piece. I have the concept book from Narnia, so I referenced that for armor designs. I also use Warhammer Online reference material as well. I have some of their old magazines that they used to publish and give out for free. So I have a couple of those, and generally the cover illustrations are really good reference material for battle scenes because there's so much characters within the scene, and there's also a lot of detail. So between all that reference material, I was able to come up with this piece, and it did evolve over the duration of quite a few different rendering attempts. As you can see, I'm actually trying to rough out my anatomy for my characters before I actually start working on this. That's something I normally typically do for most of my pieces, but later on you'll see me actually approach this in a different manner, and it worked quite a bit better than what I normally use as a technique. So initially, I was going to have two human-like characters fighting each other, but I did change that later on. So as you can see, these are the initial stages when I'm roughing out the general pose for my main characters, which are the central and focal point of the entire illustration. I'm working on some of the foreground characters, figuring out how they're going to interact with each other, how they're actually going to be moving, all the while trying to keep all my illustration elements within a certain frame. So as you can see, I have the blue lines that are my reference guides so that I know not to go out of those lines for the majority of my material. So I did come up with some pretty good poses for these characters, even if I didn't end up using most of the information that was actually here. I did end up changing it quite a bit as I worked throughout this piece. So this entire piece actually took close to 7 to 8 hours, which is almost a third longer than what it normally takes me to work on a piece. So it was significantly longer, but there's also a lot more aspects in this piece that were more difficult to work on. But that being said, I learned so much through this piece. This piece alone, I learned an entirely new way of approaching my illustration design, and it worked in most cases. So at this stage, I decided that I was stiffening up too much my drawing style. It wasn't looking very appealing. So I went with a completely different type of thumbnailing style, which is I essentially worked out with very harsh black and whites my initial subject matter. So I'm working more with the silhouettes rather than the actual structure. This helps me keep from stiffening up, and I do sometimes use this, but in this case I found this was a lot easier to work with than having to figure out the structure first and foremost, because it allowed me to really experiment with silhouettes and armor designs, which were also something I was trying to focus on during this piece. So I got to experiment very quickly with several different characters and armor designs in a very short period of time. So this really sped up my overall drawing time. If I cut out everything previous to this, the illustration actually probably only took about 4 to 5 hours, including this rough stage, because this is essentially a giant thumbnail that I'm working on right now. But it's giving me all the composition elements. It's helping me figure out my major character elements that I want to add into this piece, and the overall composition, which is the most important aspect for any piece. So once I figured that out, then the rest is generally a lot easier to work on, and I'm not worrying about doing too much detail. I'm just working on the overall composition. I'm not losing my focus. So once I started doing this type of approach for my drawing, everything really sped up drawing wise, and I was able to achieve a much better look. At this point, I decided that having two human-like characters, it didn't give me the theatrical look I was looking for. Now, because of the duration of this recording, I did lose some portion of it, which is why I've actually skipped forward, because I couldn't salvage that video footage. But as you can see, I'm able to really work out now that I have that basic thumbnail underneath, and I've lowered the opacity of that. I'm really able to figure out how I'm actually going to structure these armor designs, and I can experiment further with them and figure out how I'm actually going to go about detailing it. So this character is essentially my foreground element, so he needs to have more detail than any of the surrounding characters. So I am careful to add much more detail, especially later on with the highlights, to make sure that he really stands out from the rest of the piece. As you can see, I took the basic structure that I had underneath during the thumbnail stage, and I used the majority of that information when I started fleshing out the character. However, I did add additional detail as I went along. This is important because if you don't keep on adding at least a little bit more detail as you go, your drawing looks too rough in the end. And to avoid that, it is generally better to just keep on adding a little bit additional detail until you're satisfied with the end results. So although there's quite a bit of variation between the different armor designs, I did try to keep the general themes of the armor fairly similar. So the way I approach these armor designs is I did decide that although all these humans are banding together, they all come from a different background, and as such, they have their own preference towards armor styles. But they still fit within the general demographic area in which they come, because they are coming from the general same surrounding areas. They do share quite a few traits in their armor construction. So although their armor construction does vary a bit, there is some strong similar elements between each of these armor designs. So there's quite a bit of additional work that's actually done to embezzle them. The shoulder, although the shoulder armor does vary quite a bit, there's still certain elements which help draw these together to form this final illustration. As I was working on this, as I was finishing up the main characters that I had initially planned out to draw, I eventually began adding in additional characters. This just helps fill up the space of surrounding the character and really helps emphasize the fact that there is a large number of humans that are actually trying to fight these demonic-like creatures. Just working on the sword right now. I'm minimizing the amount of detail in that character because he is further in the background, as you can see. Although this character here, you wouldn't technically see that character if I was to print it, it is still very important to fully flesh out the characters as you work, because sometimes what the printers will do is they'll cut too much into the image, so they're able to just shift it slightly to salvage the printing. So for this reason, I do create a significant amount of bleed in my printable areas, so that in case the printer does need to encroach in some of that area or needs to do some modifications, they do have more than enough space. It also simplifies my task when I'm setting up my files for printing, because I do generally set them up fully before I send them off for the printer. It saves the printer some time. It also ensures that I get the type of quality I'm looking for as well, because I generally know at that point if I hand them the file, it's going to look exactly what I want, or pretty close to it. There's sometimes some color variations, but it's normally very minor. So what I'm actually doing for the robe of that character is I actually just used the lasso tool to create some of that robe area. It's just a really quick way to get some almost random-like and harsh edges to an area. So once I did that, I had to work on the silhouettes to make sure that it did look like there was quite a bit of action that was receding in the background, all the while having all that information come up towards the center, which is the main focal point, the battle between this dark entity and the human. So I'm just adding some additional characters right now. That one side was fairly empty, so I had to fill it up with some additional characters, and at which point I realized that I had made them too small, so I just scaled them up in order to fit the type of perspective that they would be typically in. Just adding some fog in between the characters. This fog was actually really important because it really helped showcase also the scale and the heaviness, because as these characters are walking through this battlefield, they would displace quite a bit of dirt, and it is important to include that. If you don't include it, it tends to look very rigid and stiff. So for this reason, I did definitely include it. Just bumping up the shadows right now. Really bumping up the shadows on the foreground elements, as you can see. Now, the final image that you're going to see actually has some additional highlights that I added in, because when I zoomed out, I realized I couldn't see enough of the highlights, especially in the foreground elements, so I went in afterwards and I added some additional highlights to this overall piece. Just bumping up some highlights here right now. And I'm fading out those two characters so that they look more like they're a background element. So this is the finalized illustration, as you can see. It was really fun to work on. I learned so much while working on this piece. And I was able to experiment a lot with the armor design, which is something I can't typically do with a single character. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.